אז אני גם מדבר בעברית, באנגלית, סליחה. almost. ואני אשאר בישיבה. So קודם כל, תודה רבה. Thank you to Drs. Horat and Seyman who invited me to participate. It's really a pleasure to be here and to share the stage with my panelists. So I'm going to do a little bit something קצת שונה, a little bit different. I'm going to be looking at the impact or lack of impact of siruvim and the intersections of religious and civil law, focusing on the issue of sarvanut get, which, as Dr. Porat said, was the focus of my doctoral dissertation and the book that I'm now working on. Now, in contrast to my illustrious panelists, rather than examining siruvim like theoretically or on this kind of macro level or, structurally, I'm, as an issue of religious arbitration or freedom of religion, something else is on my agenda because I completed the first comparative study of Jewish divorce refusal in Toronto and New York, which are the largest Jewish populations in their respective countries. So I'm going to offer a little bit something different on siruvim today. I'm going to focus the context of get refusal and sarvanut, which I see not necessarily as micro level, but as a particularly salient case study of the real life impacts that siruvim can have, both in terms of their potential, but also in terms of their potency. Right? So the chashivut that sarvanut can have. You understand what I'm saying. Especially for the lives of women, okay? And I would be remiss if I didn't focus on women since I'm the only woman up here. As a law and society scholar, and I'll see if this works, lovely. As a law and society scholar, I'm also not focused solely on what the law is doing. But I like to look at what happens in the legal realm actually is relevant and how that legislation and precedents at the nexus, especially of law, gender, religion, domestic abuse, how they impact real people and their decision-making and lives on the ground in their everyday. In other words, what happens within the legal realm, it doesn't happen in a vacuum, right? Zeloni sharsha. And so I'm going to make my remarks with the practical applications and realities in terms of what is happening with siruvim in relation to siruv get. And so this is where we're going. This is our journey. There are three main takeaways from my remarks today. Number one, siruvim have power, and when executed, they serve as an important and the least controversial potential remedy to get refusal. Number two, siruvim are not executed enough, and when they are not issued expeditiously enough, both to the detriment of women. And number three, siruvim are not anachronistic, meaning outdated, irrelevant, which is a common accusation that is leveled against them. They are in line with socio-legal practices and values today. So here we go. I'm going to expand on each of these three. So in Israel, like in the United States and Canada, women cannot rely on the civil realm alone to protect them from domestic abuse. Okay? Even when there are civil laws that attempt to prevent the abuse of get refusal, such as the amendments made to the Family Law Act in Ontario, just have the little excerpt here, or the Divorce Act federally, which applies to all of Canada, and the amendments made to the Domestic Relations Law in New York, and the amendments made to the Equitable Distribution Bill in New York. All of these amendments made in the late 80s and 90s, and all of them basically give courts the discretion, civil courts, the discretion to dismiss any matrimonial claim or strike any pleadings by a spouse who fails to remove all barriers to religious remarriage, right? So basically, anybody who doesn't give a get, they have no standing in court, theoretically. And so the remaining spouse can claim it all. Now, it sounds nice, but these civil laws have a lot of loopholes, both in terms of civil law and in terms of halakha, and so they are not reliable solutions for women, despite the noteworthiness of their existence in terms of legal pluralism. And even when we have important case precedents to rely on, which offer financial incentive, but not an actual remedy to the abuse of get refusal, such as the Supreme Court case from Canada in 2007, Bruker-Markowitz, where a get was placed in a divorce agreement and the court granted the wife a significant reward for breach of contract, because the husband ignored the agreement where he agreed to give a get, yet still the system has limits. They could not compel the get. Okay? And even when civil pre- or post-nuptial agreements are signed, they are not effective in remedying instances of get refusal in all instances. I've heard of cases where a page simply gets lost, a page isn't filed correctly, the husband can afford to pay the penalty, not called penalty, that is in the prenup, or a husband is too poor to pay, and so machbat lo, if there's another penalty, right? And even in jurisdictions where domestic abuse is clearly defined in law, and where judges do have social context education and cultural sensitivity training, still not all concern with themselves with the religious abuse that is get refusal. So in other words, and even though I'm saying this to a room full of lawyers or future lawyers, I'm not a lawyer, by the way, law in this case has limits, okay? It doesn't offer solutions. And those limits become even more crystallized when we turn from the civil law towards get refusal, okay? Civil law simply cannot be relied upon. And so I want to be very clear, while it's important that we continue to use civil remedies where we can, and we should continue to develop more of them, I think, in Israel, for example, we have to define domestic abuse in law to fall in line with the international shift towards defining domestic abuse as coercive and controlling behavior, like I have here the excerpt from Canada, which they're moving to in the United Kingdom, in individual states in the United States, and other jurisdictions. And I advise this as part of a grab bag or toolbox of solutions to get refusal. I've argued that elsewhere. But today, despite all of these civil remedies, which are important and which we should continue to invest in, which are important pluralist remedies, we cannot and should not underestimate the power of the siruv, which is what we're here to talk about. And here I'm going to quote, actually, pluralist scholar Sally Falk-Moore. She says, and I quote, "Innovative legislation and other attempts to direct change often attempt to fail." Why? Because even when they succeed wholly and partially, they frequently carry with them unplanned or unexpected consequences. And this is because new laws are thrust upon ongoing social arrangements, where there are already complexes of binding obligations in existence. What does this mean? What does it mean, binding obligations already in existence? That means we cannot just put civil law remedies on a religious law problem when we already have religious law solutions, like the siruv. So the most traditional and widely accepted protocol that is, generally protocol for bate din around the globe when facing a recalcitrant spouse is to issue 3 hazmanot and then ultimately a siruv, if there's no real movement to negotiate a get in good faith. Now, the length between each of these hazmanot and a siruv, that is the Wild West. It is completely inconsistent throughout the globe. If and ultimately when a beit din does issue a siruv subsequent to 3 hazmanot, it is only at that point that a woman gets the kavod of being called an aguna, both in terms of halacha and in terms of kihila. Even if she experiences abuse for years in the legal realm, in the religious realm, that the husband perpetuates by manipulating the beit din system to delay the siruv while waiting for a beit din to finally issue the siruv, she is still not considered an aguna until the siruv is issued, right? It is only at that point that the Hilchot Rabbeinu Tam from the 12th century can be initiated. And so these include all kinds of excommunication, and that means that essentially without a siruv, a woman is powerless, right? She's invisible in the eyes of halacha and in the eyes of kihila. She is a sitting duck, as we say in English. Now, this alone should be very powerful enough to tell us how important a siruv can be for a woman. Women that I interviewed describe getting the siruv as finally being seen after being invisible for years, no longer feeling invisible, feeling validated, feeling empowered. By issuing a siruv, a dual purpose is served, right? She becomes an aguna, but he also becomes a persona non grata. There's a socio-legal dimension. She is offered more support in the rights of the law and in her community, and he is simultaneously stripped of the same. today, in today's post-Me Too era, and in the midst of cancel culture, the Siruv actually should be very powerful. It fits right in line with where we are as a society around the world. In the pre-digital, pre-global, pre-tech age, a Siruv had very limited impact because when it was issued, a recalcitrant spouse could simply get on his donkey and move, right? Today, the Siruv has no jurisdictional limitations. No man can hide from it. He becomes chained to his decision to chain his wife. And no man can debate of Siruv's validity, really, despite the other controversial remedies that exist for get refusal, like get zikui, get al-tnai, hafkaot, etc. The one precondition for the positive impact of the Siruv is that it needs to exist, right? In order for it to have effect, someone has to issue it. And so that brings us to point number 2, that Siruvim are not executed enough, and when they are, they're not executed expeditiously enough, both to the detriment of women. So now that we've established that Siruvim are potentially very powerful and not controversial as a tool to fight get refusal, it's all the more distressing that my research shows that they are rarely ever issued, both in Israel and abroad. And even when there is a record of domestic abuse violations in the civil courts. Okay? So, for example, in the Canadian context, the Toronto Beit Din, which is, by the way, the only Orthodox Beit Din in Toronto, and one of the leading in Canada, the Beit Din in Toronto does not issue Siruvim. Nekuda. Okay? They admitted this on the record a few years ago. We got a new rabbi from the Beit Din of America, the Rabbinical Council of America, to our shul in Canada, the largest modern Orthodox Beit Knesset in Canada. The previous rabbi, by the way, refused to talk to me about agunot. Anyway, I digress. And this rabbi, we had a big panel, lots of advertisements, hundreds of people showed up. The night before, the Beit Din called the Rav. We want you to cancel the event. Levatel. Lama. We thought they were worried about the women. It was me and one other woman on the panel. But in fact, they didn't care about us. They cared about the rabbi from the Beit Din who agreed to sit on the panel. They were very worried about what he would say. And the truth is, they were 100% right to be worried because he admitted in front of everybody, when asked, do you issue hazmanot and siruvim? No. Lama lo? Oh, because in the event that maybe a husband won't show up, that's going to be too disrespectful, and we can't tolerate that potential disrespect, so instead we just don't issue hazmanot and we don't issue a siruv. Can you imagine? So, are there women who are misuravat get in Toronto? Absolutely, right? But the lack of siruvim don't even enable them to be considered an aguna, so they are rendered invisible, legally, socially. Okay? Instead of issuing the siruv that a husband will abuse, right? They're allowing the husband to abuse their wife by them also abusing the wife, okay? In the US and Canada, as well as Israel, data demonstrates that men constantly manipulate the Beit Din and the entire system, right? By claiming shalom bayit and doing all kinds of other tactics to delay issuing siruvim in very, very high rates. So, while they are very impactful when they are issued, this is actually rarely the case. Now, this is not even what's noteworthy, right? Like, we all know this. What is noteworthy, and which is not normative, is that the Bate Din are not only refusing to look outside themselves for remedies, right? They don't want to look to civil solutions. That is normative, right? When there are competing power structures, they want to hold on to their power. What is not normative is that they are also refusing to look inside their systems for remedies. And that is really what is noteworthy, okay? And this brings me really to my final takeaway today. I have not following time at all, so sorry. Siruvim, I don't even know what my slides are. We're coming to this. Okay, Siruvim are not anachronistic, which is a common accusation, meaning I hear all this all the time because I speak, to the secular public, and they say, oh, well, this kind of thing is just archaic, a siruv lo shayach lanu in this day and age. And I argue totally the opposite, right? Because my research supports this grab bag or toolbox of remedies, which include internal religious and external civil remedies, I get to hear the complaints about all of the remedies all the time. For example, Susan Weiss, a Mekomate from the Center for Women's Justice, she said a few years ago, we should be ashamed that we have to use siruvim. Shaming is shameful. That was the quote. But in fact, they are a socio-legal tool which spans centuries in our halachic responsa, and they also take us to the pages of the Insta influencers of today, okay, at least within the Jewish world. So I want to look at a couple of historical precedents, thanks to my own archival research in the North American context, and also to Chaim Sperber's book, which looks at Europe, where the rabbis themselves took out ads to publicize the siruv as a very public tool of the effectiveness of it. Okay? So first of all, this is a recent decision, I think just off of the press, is from the 7th of May, where the different groups work together, which is very rare in Israel, I understand, to prevent Meir Kin, notorious global get refuser, to have his father buried in Israel. Okay? His mother died a few years back. They tried to prevent her from being buried in Israel. He agreed to give a get to his wife of many, many, many years, and he said he would. It was in a negotiation, and then they buried his mother, and then he didn't give his wife a get. He, of course, is already remarried, heter rabbanim, the whole thing. Okay? So now a new decision, his father will not be allowed to be buried here. This is what a siruv potentially can enable. Okay? I'm going to skip this. This is a video of picketing, which happens a lot in Israel, but not for agunot, in the American context. What also, you can only have that with a siruv. Here we have an example from the Jewish Daily Forward. This is Hebrew letters, but it's Yiddish language. A gallery von verschwundene Männer, a gallery of vanished husbands. Okay, so a wanted ad. This is of the classic aguna, men who deserted their wives, not who were recalcitrant. But nonetheless, we have here examples of what a siruv can enable when we are willing to use it. Okay, so rabbis funded this column and many other columns. This is throughout North America, a weekly column publicizing the whereabouts of these men to help the women. Two examples here from Hamagi, July 1866, in Europe, published throughout Europe. Again, here we have examples of rabbis in leading communities in Warsaw, in many different areas throughout Eastern Europe, taking out at their own expense ads in papers to support women after they themselves issued the siruvim. Okay, and another one here from 1873. So, these are not far off and irrelevant, right? Oh, there we go. And a few snippets from modern day, a few memes that you may recognize. This is Gital Dodelson on the cover of the New York Post as well. So again, we can only have this kind of activism, legal, social, rabbinic activism, when a siruv is in place. And more. Okay. So in conclusion, and what I just said, right, that was all this idea of e-shaming, using the internet, using technology to bring about a get, to actualize the siruv, is relevant today and can have both socio-legal impacts. And so even though it may not exact a get in all cases, it can exact a get in some cases. And so we should use every tool at our disposal. And even where it doesn't exact a get, it still can empower women. And we shouldn't forget about the women, okay? So in conclusion, the role of the siruv is a potentially very powerful tool to remedy the abuse that is get refusal, one which is halachic and not controversial, despite the North American context in which rabbinic courts don't have the backing of the state to enforce siruvim with sanctions, such as revoking licenses and passports like you do here in Israel. It is still incumbent upon us to use the siruv. And yet many Bate Din refuse to issue that. And when they do, justice delayed is justice denied, and they don't do so fast enough to the detriment of women, and we all suffer as a result. Moreover, siruvim are not as germane and crucial today, or just as germane and crucial today as they were then. Thank you.